Today we got some more actual history about the life and times of Lewis Wetzel. This is episode 2 of the Unworthy History mini-series focusing on Lewis Wetzel's development into an Indian scout, bent on revenge for his father's death at their hands. We will be reading from this book, Lewis Wetzel, the renowned Virginia Ranger and Scout, His Life and Adventures by Robert Cornelius V. Meyer. This book was published all the way back in 1890. The chapter we'll be reading in this episode is called The Indian Scout. First, we will hear many stories about men who took on the role of Indian scouts after their family members had been killed and their homes destroyed. We will also hear about one woman who became an Indian scout after she was severely wronged at the hands of several braves. Then we will hear about the young Lewis Wetzel, still a boy following his captivity, enter into a meeting of the leaders of the town and demand that they make him an Indian scout. The times were such as admitted very rarely of any intermediate course of action whatsoever. It was either for or against. It was a time of peculiar unquiet and turbulence. The revolution was at its height. It seemed doubtful which way the war must eventually turn, and the desperation became synonymous with bravery in the urging of their rights by the colonists. The troubles in the interior called for all the aid the colonies could grant, leaving the frontier almost completely exposed and defenseless. The British called in and stimulated the already reckless and embittered Indians to make inroads upon cultivated lands and tethered stock. These inroads left everything changed, and barrenness and waste were on every hand. Scenes of murder were of frequent occurrence, and death was not always the worst penalty inflicted upon the captive settlers. These were only too often mere women and children, the men having marched inland hastily, leaving their families in the hands of divinity, while they were enrolled as rebels against His Majesty of England. There were renegades, too, among the early settlers, who, being offended by slights, real or imaginary, inflicted by their brother immigrants, were the most energetic of the advisers of the Indians in their barbarous mode of warfare, and were benefited by the lion's share of the spoils. Simon Girty is one of these men, because of some offered slight, the nature of which is mostly conjectural after this long period of time, and few authentic proofs being at hand, if any in existence. He deserted and joined the Indians, and became a horror to his former white associates. His exquisite cruelty was something original in the simple annals of the first settlers. His fury against the whites resembled more the paroxysms of a maniac than the deliberate cruelty of even a naturally ferocious temperament. No inquisitor of old could have enjoyed more unmoved the throes of agony wrung from the tortured white man than did Simon Girty. As mounted on his horse, he would look out at the barbarous scenes enacted by the raging Indian braves, with all their wiliness and suspicion of the whites. The Indians seemed to have reposed confidence in this man, strange as it may appear. His fiendishness may have awed them, and made them look to him as the incarnation of their own worst traits, which worse traits are oftener obeyed than better ones. At any rate, they held to him, and were willing to be guided by him in depredations they would never have thought of but for him. He appears to have lost all moral sensibility, to have been deaf to the voice of friendship save on one occasion, and that occasion is that Kenton, who as Girty's fellow spy went by the name of Butler, was at last taken prisoner by the Indians in a raid he had instituted against them, and after being mercilessly tortured, was condemned to the stake, and besought Girty's intervention. Girty really did work hard to save his friend, and brought the influence of the noble and simple Chief Logan to bear in his case. "Young man," said Logan to the captive, "my people seem very angry with thee. What cause have they?" "They are angry, I don't know why," said Kenton respectfully, and looking over to Girty. "Tell me the truth," said Logan. "I only know I have fought with your people, then became their enemy and fought against them," returned Kenton boldly. "Be of good cheer," said the chief. "A man is not base for fighting against his enemies. My people speak of burning you at Sandusky, but I will send runners before, and they will speak you fair at Sandusky." By dint of wily and yet brave maneuvering and risk, Kenton escaped and Girty was his savior. But Girty was not the only man who acted so insanely against his brethren. With such men in their midst, often unknown to be anything but their warmest champions, what had the settlers not to fear? The money of the British doubtless played a leading part with many of these spies. Old Eberly writes, Today I buried my Britannia teapot, for I mortally fear to be called on to deliver it up, it being of a tempting richness to the British spies, that seem to be here, there, and everywhere, without us knowing who they be. There was no use in making any complaints, for there was no one in authority with whom to lodge a complaint. If a spy was discovered, the only righteous mode of dealing with him was to kill him as a dangerous reptile, without waiting for any intervention of so-called law. For there was little or no law within reach of the frontiersmen, and each was compelled to be soldier, prosecutor, and judge in his own defense, and to use his strong arm in the interest of his hard-earned property and his helpless family. As the Indian Code was one of total extermination, the white settler was compelled to adopt the Indian's tenets, and no mercy nor parley was granted. From this, only further cruelty, barbarity, and hatred could arise. And there sprang up among the settlers, after a night of horror and devastation, the Indian scout, a man sworn to hunt down the Indian, to destroy him upon his own ground, to have no mercy, to be an avenging fate to wrongdoers. The services of these scouts were wholly voluntary, and their supplies were furnished by themselves at their own cost. There was a settler who sold all his little belongings, and came with the money procured therewith in his hand, and handing it over to a man in authority, said, "This is all I have. I give it to you if you will let me be a scout. If I die, the money can be divided between you. Should I live, then I can work for myself and gain more." It was known that a woman who had suffered intense wrong at the hands of the Indians had vowed a fierce revenge. A scout was encountered in the Indian trails who spoke to no man. Stern, sad of face, heavy-browed, he went on his way, ferreting out stray Indians and killing them without mercy and in silence. He associated with no man. He spoke not of his prowess. He never made a display of the scalps of his victims, if he ever took any. He was scarcely seen to eat, and when he slept, no one conjectured. Stern, ruthless, he killed and spared not men, women, and even little children. All fell before the rifle that never left his hand. It was said that a score of Indians bit the dust in his track within a month, and still he went silently on. Once, a cold, stormy night, another scout came across him going through the blinding snow towards an Indian camp, a heavy bag thrown across his shoulders, his gun no longer by his side, his right hand grasping the bag and holding it in place, his left hand hidden in the breast of his coat. His fellow scout spoke to him, and he turned jaded eyes upon him and smiled, the first smile that anyone had seen on his face since he had mysteriously come into contact with the other scouts. He was asked where he was going. He pulled his left hand from his coat and pointed towards the Indian camp. His hand had been shattered by the premature explosion of his gun, and he was powerless henceforth. What then could he be going for in the direction of the Indian camp? He passed by his fellow scout and went through the snow. The other man turned and sought shelter, and wrapping himself in a blanket, slept. He knew not how long he slept, but all at once he was awakened by an earthquake. He thought that heaven and earth had come together, but everything was still when he opened his eyes. For all that, his heart was beating wildly, and he could not think he had been dreaming. But no repetition of the sound occurred, and still the soft white snow fell gently and softly outside. He argued with himself that he had been dreaming, and that the start he had experienced when the other scout had shown his shattered hand had produced the dream. He had imagined the exploding gun. But when it was light, he went toward the Indian camp discovered the night before. The snow had also wiped out most of the marks of devastation that wounded, silent traveler had caused, for the scout came across the form of the man dead in his path, covered with snow, and with limbs and members of 5 or 6 Indians nearby. The bag on the silent scout's back had been filled with gunpowder, which, knowing that his useless hand would forever debar him from the use of a rifle, he had collected in some manner, and, as a last revenge, had gone to the campfire and thrown it in, taking death thus, himself perishing with the last fruits of his undying hatred. This the man who found the body readily understood, and gazed with awe upon the wild work of the strange being, who rested under the snow before him. He leaned down before that form, and scraped the snow away from the face. He opened the coat and then started back in horror, for the silent scout, the deadly destroyer of all Indians, man, woman, and child, was the woman who had been foully wronged by Indian braves. This story was brought into Wheeling along with the body of the woman. Her death made more scouts than her life could have made. A thirst for Indian blood arose. Men coaxed for the privilege of being recognized as avengers of white man's blood. Even children were told that their duty was to kill. All this argued that it was animal against animal, but such is not the case. It was awakening intelligence against rudely awakened intelligence. There are people, even at this late day, who hold that the Indian is a wronged man and a brother, and that the most uncivilized mode has ever been adopted to civilize him. He was naturally a brave and reckless man, protecting his rights and allowing no encroachment upon what he claimed as his own. He did not hate the whites, the Long Knives, till he thought they usurped his privileges. Day by day his lodge was moved further and further towards the setting sun. His ranks thinned of his young warriors and maidens by the promises, honest and specious, of the whites. He could not accept civilization because, like the bison, civilization meant a bridle to his personality. War was the favorite pursuit of this martial people, and military glory their ruling passion. Agriculture and the laborious drudgery of domestic life were left to the women. The education of the Indian was solely directed to hunting and war. From his early infancy he was taught to bend the bow, to point the arrow, to hurl the tomahawk, and to wield the club. He was also taught to track his enemy's footstep through the almost impregnable forest, to mark the faintest indications of danger, to find his way by the appearance of the trees and by the stars. He must endure fatigue, cold, famine, every privation. The Indians had an exalted spirit of liberty, which revolted against all control. They considered themselves sovereigns accountable to no one but Manitou, the Great Spirit or God. The Indian brave despised death, but he regarded it with indifference. He seldom committed suicide because patience and endurance are the first duties of a warrior, leading to high rewards, and none but cowards yield to pain and misfortune. He was taught from early infancy that the Great Spirit would be offended by any change in the red man's mode of life handed down by ancient tradition. He believed in all the wild and debasing superstitions that his wise men taught him. He left tobacco on rocks as a sacrifice to invisible spirits. His every act must conciliate some spiritual influence. He was willing in the beginning to act as a guide to the chance white man, and looked upon the interloper at first almost as a superior being. Roger Williams says, "I have been guided by them 20, 30, and 40 miles through woods, on a straight course out of my path. When the English first came to this country, it was admirable to see what paths their naked feet had made in the wilderness, in the most stony and rocky places. On the whole, we may speak of them as a brave, reckless, generous, and unfortunate people. Imagine such a people suffering under an imaginary wrong, thinking their simple lives set aside and circumvented by cunning and fraud. What they claimed by law of primogeniture was taken from them, and they were forced to make treaties with a stranger, who had no right to anything, in order to ensure possession of what had always been theirs. Ignorant, as we reckon ignorance, filled with their own importance, what could they not become when desperate? A simple, holy nature perverted becomes more vile than the veriest reveler in all villainies. The whites who came to them with offered services when they were fighting off the settlers, that daily encroached a little upon their reserves, were of the most depraved nature, and sided with them only to wreak some petty vengeance upon their brothers, or to gain by foul means what they dared not claim by fair. The Indian, a lover of bravery, must have seen in all the whites but prototypes of those who claimed their aid in their own quarrels. They became the fiends we know during the Indian Wars. All the unbridled passions of man, often more fierce than those of the beasts, were given full license in their determination to wipe out the encroacher. They knew no reason. They saw no rights but their own. They were frequently imposed upon in the childishness of their trust, and they became suspicious of all. The writer has in his hands a little pamphlet written by an adjutant in a Western military reserve, and circulated by his superior officer, describing a peculiar dance which he witnessed in the Unkpapa country, where he was stationed in 1871. Some of the features of this ghastly saturnalia are gleaned from it here as a sample of human endurance. The sunflower dance is one of the most important dances or ceremonies among the American Indians, and at this dance new braves are admitted to an equality with those already proved as braves, who are called soldiers or principal warriors, and have an extra lodge, a large wigwam in every big tribe, where no women are admitted, and where they hold their council councils. It is called the sunflower dance on occasion of the season in which it occurs, that is, in the month of June or July, when the river edges are decked with a species of sunflower which the Indian maidens use for decorating themselves on this occasion. The ground chosen for the dance is a level stretch of land without tree or shrub, except one young ash tree of about 30 feet high, and devoid of limbs and branches for 20 feet from the ground. A short distance from the ground, the narrator referred to saw several Indian grave mounds, raised on high sticks above the ground, and then each covered with red and white blankets. Skeletons of horses were lying at the foot of some of the graves, indicating that someone held specially dear, as mother, father, great warrior, or pretty woman, is buried there. It is the custom among these Indians to kill a fine horse or a good mule on the graves of their best friends, and give in this manner the coyote and buzzard a feast, to keep them for a while from attacking the bodies of the loved ones. In communities of brave, simple people, however, even from Homer's time, animals belonging to the dead have been slaughtered, and with a noble and more poetic meaning than the one quoted above, which may be only as the white, practical American understood it. During the sunflower dance, about 11 a.m., the Indians began to assemble from all parts of the country, almost all on horses or ponies, the men and women riding alike astride. The spectators posted themselves on the nearest hills from which they could best see the proceedings. Those more immediately concerned in the dance dispersed themselves, parading over the festival grounds, all gaily dressed and exhibiting on poles their enemies' scalps. After gravely taking whiffs from a pipe, which was passed from hand to hand, and blowing the smoke in 2 streams from the nostrils, and raising their heads to the sun, by which they meant to offer a sacrifice of incense to the Great Spirit above, a drum was placed in the center of the braves, and each warrior produced a thin ash branch, one end decorated with red ribbon. The women sat on the ground, forming an outer circle around the warriors, and began to sing, the men beating the drum. A chief named Kill Eagle now rose from the ground, and stood looking around him for some time in mute dignity, until a silence of death prevailed. He stands still, scanning the multitude for perhaps 10 minutes. He does not speak, yet the people evince no impatience. They are as still as the hills around them. At length the chief begins to speak in low but impressive tones, which become louder as he proceeds, and furious and menacing as his subject affects him, the substance of his discourse, which lasted more than an hour, being the past glories of the Sioux nation, the triumphs of their fathers in war and in the chase, the courage displayed by his people, and their honorable deaths in battles against their foes, or in their lodges in their old age, surrounded by their children and the scalps of their enemies. He did not want his young men to think that he alluded to his white brethren, with whom he desired his people to be at peace, as it is the wish of the Great Father that they should live as brothers, but he meant those thieving, robbing Indians of other tribes, whom it would please the Great Spirit that they should punish for past crimes, such as stealing their horses, carrying off their young women to other tribes, and killing, when they could, any hunter of his people whom they might find alone on the prairie. To punish those bad men, they should have brave men, and as the number of his braves was getting small, through the death of those lost in battle and from old age, he wanted young blood in their braves, to uphold the honor of his nation. They did not want women to do their fighting, nor men with women's hearts in their bosoms, but men of tried courage and bravery. He said that any of his young men that wished to prove themselves as braves might prove it as their fathers before them had done, that any of them that did not feel his heart big should stay among the women. And those who did come for trial should remember that the eyes of their fathers, mothers, sisters, sweethearts, and friends would be upon them. He said that they should prove themselves as men able to endure, as brave men would do, and that the Great Spirit despises cowards, and forever banishes them from the happy hunting grounds. The time has sped on, it is 12:30 now, and further crowds by this time have streamed in. The medicine man now stands up and calls the young men who are anxious for trial. About 60 stalwart young Indians from different parts of the crowd now enter the ring and throw off their blankets. These are the candidates. Drums beat. The Indian women sing. Each youth has a wreath of green leaves placed upon his head. The pipe is passed around. 4 warriors step into the ring, 2 carrying lassos. The first two approach the line of young men, leading forth the first to the stake, and the medicine man throws the youth on his back on the ground. The medicine man, bending over the prostrate man, cuts 2 slits in his right breast, about an inch apart and 3 inches long, and the blood flows freely and trickles to the ground. Then he cuts 2 more slits in the left breast, like those in the right, running the knife up and down under the skin to raise it from the flesh. Next, the end of a lariat is passed under the skin, drawn across the breast and passed under the skin of the other cut, and drawn so far through as if sufficient to knot it to the other part of the lariat in front of the breast. He is then fastened by the lariat to the bare ash tree, and is expected to free himself by breaking the holds on his breast. For he cannot break the lariat. He pulls and pulls, yells and jumps, but the skin is tough. The crowd scream with delight. He tries again and breaks one hold. The loss of blood and the pain weakens him, and he seems doomed. But 2 stout warriors seize him by the shoulders, and fling him from the ponderous force until they break the other hold. He rises from the ground, picks up his blanket coolly, and retires. The next young man steps forward. He has cuts made in the calves of his legs, to which are fastened the skulls of buffalo heads, and he is left to dance and jump about until he breaks loose from the skulls. One young Hunkpapa Sioux was so eager to distinguish himself that when he came to trial he walked in between 4 posts, having 2 in front and 2 in the rear, and had 4 holes cut in his breast, and 4 in his 2 shoulders. Through each of these holes a lariat is drawn and fastened to the post, having about 3 feet of the lariat slack to allow him to move back and forth. He began to jump and leap, sometimes straining on the lariat in front, and then on the ones fastened to his back, at other times jumping high, bringing the strain equally on all the fastenings. He continued to jump and leap thus, like some wild animal trying to leap out of a trap, for perhaps a half hour, but could not get one of the fastenings loose, and at last he fainted from pain and loss of blood. A crowd of warriors gathered around him and soon restored him to consciousness by pouring cold water over him. The lariats are still fastened to him, none daring to loosen them, until he desires it himself or until he dies. He is very weak now and is not able to make any more efforts to free himself. He calls for his horse, a stout snow-white Indian pony, which is now brought into the ring, and 2 of the lariats are unfastened from 2 of the posts in his rear, and fastened to the pommel on the saddle on the horse's back. The horse is turned from him and gets a cut with a whip from one of the warriors and makes a leap forward. These 2 lariats tear out from the young brave's back, and he is lifted from the ground where he has stumbled, and the other lariats fastened to the saddle. Then the horse is cut again with the whip and runs and plunges, and the young brave is free. He is then picked up by some warriors and carried to the ring, to all appearances dead, amid grunts of approval. This is the dance, as it is called, which causes the mothers and fathers of the competing braves to feel for many days prior to the trial uneasy for fear of their sons failing to come off creditably to their manhood. And these mothers, wishing to show that they share their sons' sufferings, often have a dozen cuts made across their arms and breasts at the time their offspring are under the torture. But the young man who presents himself for such trial, and has not the courage to carry it through, is cut loose from his fastening with the knife. He must give up all his horses, that greatest pride of the Indian, and should he be a chief's son, his hereditary title is taken from him. He cannot join any war or hunting party, nor can he wear those ornaments that distinguish a brave, such as eagle feathers or council dresses, and he is no more considered in the tribe than a woman, until such an occasion as the present is offered again. Then he has another chance to redeem himself as a man and a warrior. And this dance is still being held after all the intermixture with civilization and its modes and chances to make life easy and to shirk traditional duties and consequences. 100 years ago, and at the period with which this part of the narrative deals, the endurance was there, but the perverted nature was fresher from the source of perversion, more deadly because of the newness of the perversion, than it is now when savage life is only so by the protection of laws and civilization. The state of the country and the unprotected condition of the people were, to a great degree, the impetus to get back possessions which the red man claimed as his own still, And to get them back, the vaunted civilizing reason must not be called into play, for reason had done little but defraud them of what they now determined to have again. So they resolved to deal with the whites as they would with beasts of prey, and the whites learned to look upon the Indian as a reptile, possibly as a lion regards a viper. You cannot reason with an Indian, says a writer of the times. He will listen to you with due attention, whittling a stick as he does it, nods his head and grunts approval. The stick he is whittling is an arrow with which to pierce your heart when he is done speaking. A missionary speaking with a young brave about the wrong of his present line of action was rejoiced to see the Indian hold down his head and come before him submissively. "You are sorry for what you have done?" asked the missionary. The Indian gave a grunt of affirmation. "You wish to change your mode of life?" The same grunt of affirmation. "You wish me to extend the right hand of fellowship, and acknowledge you as a member of the family of God's children." A third time the Indian gave his grunt of approval, and came closer yet. "Then," said the missionary, "let my red brother approach me, feeling sure that his sins, though they be as scarlet, shall be made white as the driven snow. Let my red brother give to me the tomahawk in his hand." "My white brother can have it," said the Indian, raising his head for the first time, raising his hand at the same time to bury the tomahawk in the brain of the missionary. To be as deceptive and treacherous as an Indian, in the eyes of the white settlers, was eminently necessary for self-protection. The Indian sent forth spies in every direction, and the wary white man never passed a day without feeling assured that his most secret acts were that night chronicled and commented on around wigwam fires, amid the dusky shadows of the woods. This organized system of Indian spies placed the settlers in their hands, and a reaction was necessary, an offset to counteract the baneful effect. That counteraction came suddenly and effectually in the person of the Indian scout. He was not a scout, a murderer from choice, because he wished to change from the monotony of life. The times allowed little monotony. More often than otherwise, he was the victim of some base outrage at the hands of the Indian, entailing the loss of wife, child, parent, or altogether. And instead of the love for those now dead, implacable hatred found a place in his breast. There is the story of a man who, out hunting one day, came home at night and entering his cabin found no light there, and called aloud to his wife and children, but received no response. He knew that he must wait until morning to know what had become of them, so all night long he paced up and down within the narrow confines of the one room. In the early light of dawn he saw upon the wall of the room that he had walked in for hours in the darkness the hanging and mutilated bodies of his family, suspended by spikes through their hands. That man became a scout. Another man saw his youngest child dashed to pieces from a rock, where an Indian ran with it, pursued by the father. That man also became a scout. A short time after the murder of John Wetzel and capture and escape of the boys, a conclave of settlers was called in Wheeling one morning. They met with closed doors. In the midst of a harangue urging the necessity of more protection against the hordes of wandering Indians, the door noiselessly opened and someone entered. The little place was crowded, and so intent were the men that they hardly knew of the entrance of anyone, till, working his way through them, a young man, a mere boy, stood before the officers of the meeting. He was a dark-faced lad, his eyes gleaming, his hair matted with neglect and forest dews, and even then remarkably long and black. "I wish to proclaim myself an Indian scout," he said to the astonished men. One of them took him by the shoulder. "How did you dare to come here?" he asked. The lad shook off the hand. "Will you recognize me as a scout?" he asked. "Boy, do you know what you say?" returned one of the elders. "I wish to become a scout." "Go away," commanded the elder. "You are a boy with a foolish man's tongue. You are dazed by the talk of those around you. The life you would lead is not all of romance. Go home." "Home?" echoed the lad bitterly. "Do you know where my home is? That I have a home? Go to your father then, and bid him keep a stricter watch over you." "Go to my father? I wish I could," said the boy in louder tones, and resisting those who would have silenced him. "I tell you that I have no father. He is dead. I wish to hunt down his murderers, and I will do this whether you recognize me as a scout or not. Only I felt that a man as old as my father was should sanction what I do." The men were quieter now around him, and did not offer to turn him away. The president of the meeting said, not unkindly, I am sorry for you, my lad, but if you loved your father properly, you would know that murder and blood would scarcely purify your memory of him. Doubtless your love has crazed you. I am sane. Wait then, my lad, until a time when you are calm. Calm, he cried. I shall never be that until I avenge my father. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. But the lad did not heed him, but stood panting before them all, clutching his musket up to his breast, his nerves alert, his head thrown back. My mother used to read that when I had a home, he said. You speak of the love I may have had for my father. You do not know how I loved him, nor do I. I only know that the loss of him has killed whatever made me love him. It is also thus with my brothers. We were a strong, loving family. We were happy, careless boys. My father's death has made us reckless men. My father came from his birthplace where everything was well known, and where he had toiled and troubled for years. He came out to these wilds to encounter willingly far greater toils and troubles, to secure to us children ease and comfort. Our father died in attempting this for us. Our mother was a brave woman who cared for no possible trouble. She never quailed in difficulty and distress, which was often all around her. She loved my father, that made her brave. My father's death has made her a weak, trembling, frightened woman. She saw him die. She is broken, and her bravery died with what gave it to her, our father. We wish to avenge a brave mother. Does not the Bible say, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth? Did not the Bible men avenge their fathers and mothers and ruined homes? Is not Christianity avenging by civilization the murder of Christ? You have no right to deny me that which the Lord tells me is my right, not merely my privilege. The men looked at him in astonishment. Never before had a boy spoken thus before men, a boy reared in these wilds at that, a boy who had been educated only from the Bible. They could not treat him as a boy. That speech earned for him the respect due to a man. It seemed almost as though he pleaded for his father's life, as though the privilege to hunt down the Indians were a prescription that would restore his dead father back to life. There was a kindling in the eyes of those about him, but the boy minded not that, only his desire for respect, for his preferred calling was uppermost in his mind, and all things else meant nothing. Sit down, said the president, pushing a chair towards him. The lad seemed not to hear him, and continued standing. What answer ought they to give, a boy with noble instincts, but perverted reasoning? Who was your father? At last asked the president. He was John Wetzel. He helped to found this place, said the lad. There was then a murmur. Half of the men there had known John Wetzel personally at one time or another. The president of the assembly himself was not a stranger to the reckless man who had withstood the advice of his friends and chose to settle far beyond their reach and protection. He looked down at the lad standing before him, and could not but feel that John Wetzel's death had been not altogether as other men's. He had seemed to purchase it by his very hardihood. But what of the lad? Whatever the president might have said was unavailing, for he looked into the eyes of those around him and saw but one answer to his question. The boy was not to be treated as a child. There was the respect due to a man which he claimed and meant to obtain. There were cries of, "Treat the boy square. Don't go against the lad." "Go," said the president to him. "You may do what you think best." "Do you give me the privilege of a scout?" persisted the boy. "You are too young," began the president, when his voice was drowned by cries of, "Give it to him! Give it to him!" "Very well, Lewis Wetzel," said the president. "We recognize you as an Indian scout, and here's my hand on it." He held his hand out, but the lad seemed not to see it. Shouldering his musket, he walked through the lane made by the men, without a word, unlatched the door, and walked away. Straight on he walked, and the men gazing after him were silent as he. He went determinedly to his mother and told her what he meant to do, and left her trembling and weeping. "He did not even kiss me," she mourned, "and he was always the most affectionate of the children, and he was always the leader. If he goes, his brothers will not long remain here with me. I shall be a widow and childless. My brave boys will not close my eyes in death, and I have tried to be a good mother to them. It is bitter, bitter. All my energy, all my life has gone from me. Oh, for the old time of my early married life. Oh, for the time when that boy rested a babe in his cradle in the poor little home far away. Oh, for the time when his father asked me would I come here, or stay in the home that had known us both so long. Better had we died among friends, though poor, than to die here. For are we richer here? Is there as much mine now as there was when I had 1 cow and 2 pigs? But he's gone because he's brave, said a little maiden, weeping with her and her little girls. It was little Berta Rosencrantz, but no grief could bring him back again. No prayers availed to turn from his purpose the boy whose mind was so steadily set towards revenge. His little sisters had gathered about the disconsolate woman, and were holding to her in perturbation, not yet accustomed to the change in her, but doubtless pondering where was the active, tearless mother of old. Berta had run to the window, though, and was straining her neck far out to catch a glimpse of the boy who was now far off. "I see him," she cried. "He's going through the grass towards the river." Then he disappeared from her eyes. He took the trail that led to his old ruined home, and went and sat there and looked on the charred embers that alone remained to tell the story of one-time shelter and love. He sat there until night, drinking in all the sense of desolation. No longer a boy, but a man, with a wronged man's deadly sense of one never dying purpose. And at the same time, with his lonely mother, the bright-eyed little maiden sat and soothed with pretty words the older woman's sorrow. "You should be proud of him," said the girl. "Not if you were a mother," sobbed the woman. "If I were 10 times a mother," said the girl, "I should be glad to know that all my sons avenged their father's death. What are women for if they cry because a man steps up and defends them? If I were a man, I'd do. What would you do?" complained the mother. "Would you break your mother's heart? That is what children do most of all." "Then mothers ought to get tougher hearts, if they know what they've got to expect. If I was a mother 10 times over, I'd be tougher every time a child would rise up to protect me. And if I was a man, I'd do as Lewis Wetzel has done. I'd be where Lewis Wetzel is at this moment." "And where is he?" asked the mother. Thereat the girl threw herself into the woman's arms, weeping her pretty eyes dull with a passion of fruitless tears. But no sound of all this reached the man who caused it, as sitting before the ruins of his one-time home, he let the desolation of the scene enter into his soul. So that's it for this episode. Lewis Wetzel demanded to be made an Indian scout after his father's death, and there were many others like him, even this woman who was wronged by the Indians and made a vow of revenge that eventually led to her own death. I haven't found any other information about this woman or her identity. It's possible that she had no relatives who survived her. If you've heard of this story or something similar, then feel free to comment on it below. Don't miss the third of our 3 episodes about the young Lewis Wetzel that we are airing within 1 week before Thanksgiving. This episode will be released on Wednesday, November 22nd at 1 p.m. U.S. Central Time. This channel is called Unworthy History because we talk about actual history that is now deemed unworthy to show on history channels on TV. Stay tuned to this channel for more actual history directly from old books. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.